Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I will be summarizing some of the general areas that will affect happiness and the tools you can use to increase your levels of happiness and well-being. These are really based off the Huberman led podcast on improving happiness. In case you don't know who he is, Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist that talks about regular science and research-backed content. I really enjoy listening to his podcast, and so I know the content he pushes out are really based on real facts and actual studies. Highly recommend you to subscribe and listen to his content as well. I'll link the content in the description box below. So some of these areas and tools that he shares are really interesting for me because most of them really contradicts to the way we know about some happiness. I'll share more about this later. So in this video, there'll be two parts. The first would be covering through the general areas that will affect happiness, while the second will be the tools that you can actually use to create happiness yourself. So let's start off with the general areas that will affect happiness. And of course, when we talk about happiness, money would be the first thing that usually comes up. Interestingly, you may think that the higher your level of income, the more happier you'll be. But that's a misconception. In the Harvard Happiness Project and other researchers, it shows that individuals have the same levels of happiness no matter their income levels. This can possibly be from the fact that the higher your income, the more money worries that you might have as you scale up as well. But the study also goes to show that this finding is only true if the individual's basic needs have been met. So for instance, if the individual does not have an income to have a decent meal 3 times a day, they will of course have a higher level of happiness if they can have this money to fund their basic needs. So the second areas of happiness that I would like to talk about would be our birthdays. So studies have found that people tend to be unhappier during their birthdays itself. This is because birthdays are usually used as a benchmark to measure our levels of happiness against our peers. For instance, if let's say we realize that some of our peers are more successful in our definition as compared to us, we might not feel as happy. But this point also proves that our happiness is also actually relative to our peers and that we are actually bad at interpreting our own timeline as well. And finally, the most obvious area that will affect your level of happiness will be alcohol, nicotine, drugs, and trauma. These items are scientifically proven to reduce the levels of happiness for all individuals. And out of all these items, Huberman feels that trauma is the worst of it all. Trauma can affect an individual physically, emotionally, and even mentally. Symptoms would be, for example, depression, anxiety, which can increase levels of stress hormones and further impact levels of happiness. So previously, we were looking at the general areas of happiness. Now, let's look at the tools that you can use to actually create happiness for yourself. Now, Huberman describes this creation of happiness as synthetic happiness. Now, the opposite of synthetic happiness would be natural happiness. So natural happiness would be something that we learn when we are young. So when you actually receive gifts during your birthdays, or whenever you receive very good grades for your examinations, and you get recognized from this from your parents or the people around you. Now, while the word synthetic might have a negative connotation because it is associated with the word fake and unreal, Huberman prefers calling synthetic as self-directed or self-created happiness. Although the caveat here is that even though this is a self-created happiness, it does not necessarily mean that once you snap your fingers, you magically become happy. The individual still needs to put in some form of effort in order for them to feel a higher level of happiness. Now, the first tool that you can use to actually create the happiness for yourself would be a change in your environment. This can be in the form of music, as studies have shown that happier music can lead to elevated moods. Another way of changing your environment can possibly be how you are actually displaying your stuff. So maybe having lots of plants and nature around you would make the vibe of the place feel a bit more relaxed and closer to nature. Lastly, your happiness levels can also be increased by having a proper sleep-wake cycle. So what this means is that during the night time, when it reaches about 6 o'clock to 10 PM, you should actually start dimming your lights so that your eyes and your brain can actually regulate the dopamine circuits so that you will have a lesser chance of getting depression. Another scientific tool to increase your levels of happiness is to be pro-social. So pro-social means the act or behavior that's helpful in promoting social acceptance and friendships, or basically the act of gratitude, be it receiving, giving, or observing. But if you were to compare all three of these, receiving is known to have the highest levels of happiness. If you're actually giving, the caveat is that the degree of happiness of the giver is proportionate to the knowledge of how much the person receiving actually needed that help, and registers that help as well. So the next tool that we'll be looking at is to be more focused. So based off the research paper where a wandering mind is an unhappy mind, the paper actually discovered that the mere state of wandering causes the happiness levels to decrease. Majority of the people in the study that wandered were to pleasant thoughts or activities, but this is not a representation of a higher level of happiness. This is also a very interesting insight, because this means that even if the person dislikes what they are focused on, for instance like household chores or maybe cleaning the room, the fact that they are focused on that particular activity would actually lead to a higher level of happiness. So that said, Huberman then recommends meditation not so much as a mindfulness exercise, but more towards as a great way to train one's focus in our lives. Our ability to refocus is statistically significant to raising our levels of happiness. So the fourth tool that we can use to increase our levels of happiness would be to establish quality social connections. So this is an interesting one for me as well, because when we think of quality social connections, we think of close ties with friends and families, having deep heartfelt conversations with them. But it is found that quality social connections can also be shallow, trivial conversations that we have with the people around us. Essentially, the presence of another human being can actually raise our levels of happiness. For instance, there was a literature that points out that simply seeing faces in the morning and the late afternoon has shown an increase in the emotional well-being. Having this facial recognition makes a person feel more bonded. One of the social connection technique that was also shared in the podcast was eye contact. The current guide now around social skills is to maintain eye contact with someone to show their attention and establish a closer connection. However, this is only half of the truth. A study shows that rather than having constant attention, you should consistently be making and breaking eye contact. This constant shifts in attention will actually make the conversation more engaged, and therefore people will feel more socially connected with one another. And last but not least is the freedom of choice. So when I mean freedom of choice, I don't mean limiting the number of choices for someone. In fact, studies have shown that the more choices given to a person, the higher correlation of happiness they will have. Freedom of choice is the idea of whether the choices made by the individual can be backtracked. If the person's choice has got cut away from him the moment they chose it, it is reported in the study that having these options permanently can lead to a higher state of happiness. This is also interesting in understanding a bit of the psychology of humans as well. The individual will feel happier if they feel and acknowledge that the situation in front of them is out of their control. So to conclude this video, synthetic happiness is equally as potent as natural happiness. I hope these toolkits here will be useful for you to increase your emotional well-being. Of course, this is not to say that these toolkits are the end-all be-all. There are also some general areas of life that will affect our happiness that we should be working on, such as money for our basic needs or even trauma. And again, this is just a summary from the Huberman's podcast. I will highly recommend you to listen to the full 2 hours podcast, as Huberman does a great job breaking down each topic individually and even shares the research paper that he was talking about. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!